"Your Omega is dead," they told the Alpha King. 5 years later, he found him in his own palace. Hello, everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit the subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It is quick, it is free, and it is the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic, emotional, and unforgettable boy love stories like this one. Your support truly means the world to us. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where in the world you are watching from and what time it is where you are right now. We love seeing how far these stories travel and knowing who is joining us today. Now, let's begin today's story. A king can command an entire kingdom, but even a king cannot silence the truth forever. For 5 long years, the kingdom of Astera mourned a tragedy that no one dared question. Every bell in the capital had rung before sunrise. Every banner had been lowered to half-staff. Every noble family had gathered beneath gray skies to witness the farewell of the Omega, who had once stood beside the most powerful Alpha in the realm. They all believed the same story because it had been repeated so often that it became impossible to separate memory from fact. Noah Sterling was dead. Even King Lucian Ashcroft had accepted those words, though accepting them had cost him a piece of his own soul. The young Alpha, who had once been admired for his fearless confidence, slowly became a ruler known for quiet discipline instead of joyful ambition. His victories expanded the kingdom's borders, his laws brought prosperity, and his name inspired respect across every neighboring nation. Yet behind the polished marble halls and golden throne, there remained a silence no celebration could erase. Every morning before dawn, Lucian followed the same routine. He trained with the royal guard, attended meetings with his council, reviewed petitions from distant provinces, and personally inspected the palace grounds before the city fully awakened. His people believed their king never rested because duty always came first. They did not know that routine was the only thing keeping old memories from breaking through the walls he had spent years building around his heart. The palace itself had changed since Noah's supposed death. New wings had been constructed, forgotten libraries restored, hidden gardens reopened, and thousands of rare manuscripts gathered from every corner of the continent. Scholars, historians, translators, and librarians now lived inside the royal grounds, quietly preserving knowledge for future generations. Lucian approved every project, but rarely visited those peaceful halls. Books reminded him too much of the evenings Noah used to spend reading beside the palace windows, while sunlight painted warm colors across the wooden floors. 5 years had passed, yet some memories refused to fade. On an unusually cool autumn morning, a council meeting ended earlier than expected after a visiting ambassador postponed negotiations because of heavy rain. With an unexpected hour free, Lucian dismissed his guards and wandered through the older section of the palace, choosing corridors he had not entered in years. The rain tapped gently against stained glass windows while distant thunder rolled beyond the mountains, wrapping the enormous castle in an unusual stillness. As he stepped inside the Grand Royal Library, he noticed something that made him stop without understanding why. At the far end of the endless rows of bookshelves, a lone librarian stood on a wooden ladder, carefully returning an ancient volume to its proper place. The man wore simple ivory robes instead of noble clothing, his silver blonde hair tied neatly behind his neck, his movements calm and graceful, as though every shelf had become part of a familiar dance repeated countless times. Lucian could not see the stranger's face, yet an impossible feeling tightened inside his chest. It was not recognition. It was something older than memory, quieter than reason, and stronger than doubt. Then the librarian paused for just a heartbeat, gently touched the worn spine of another book exactly the way Noah used to. And in that single ordinary gesture, the king felt the certainty of everything he believed begin to crack. King Lucian remained perfectly still, his gaze fixed on the lone librarian as if the rest of the vast library had disappeared around him. The stranger climbed down from the wooden ladder with practiced elegance, carefully dusted the ancient leather binding with a soft cloth, and placed the feather duster back into a small wooden basket. Every movement carried a quiet confidence that did not belong to an ordinary palace servant. It was not only the familiar gesture that unsettled Lucian. It was the strange feeling that time itself had folded back upon a forgotten memory. Before the king could speak, The librarian bowed respectfully without raising his eyes. "Your Majesty," he said in a calm voice that sounded older than his youthful appearance. "I was not expecting visitors in this wing today." The voice was different, softer, more restrained. Yet something deep inside Lucien stirred with impossible certainty. He searched the man's face, but a pair of thin silver spectacles and longer hair altered the features enough to leave only fragments of recognition. "What is your name?" Lucien asked quietly. "Nathan Gray, Your Majesty," the librarian replied without hesitation. "I oversee the restoration of damaged manuscripts collected from the Northern Archives." The answer came naturally, almost too naturally, and that only deepened the king's unease. Nathan Gray. The name meant nothing to him. Yet every instinct whispered that it was hiding something far greater. Lucien stepped closer, pretending to examine the shelves beside the librarian. Hundreds of rare books surrounded them, their worn pages carrying the wisdom of generations. A faint scent drifted through the cool air. It was not perfume. It was cedarwood, parchment, rain, and wild jasmine blooming after a spring storm. The fragrance was so subtle that another person would never have noticed it. But Lucien had once spent countless evenings beside someone whose presence carried that exact comforting scent. He immediately dismissed the thought as impossible. 5 years had passed. Memory had a cruel habit of reshaping ordinary moments into ghosts. Nathan carefully selected another damaged volume and opened it upon a reading table beneath the tall, arched windows. Sunlight briefly escaped the clouds, casting golden patterns across the polished floor. Lucien watched the librarian remove a folded ribbon from inside the fragile pages before smoothing the paper with extraordinary care. Then came another impossible detail. Nathan always turned each page from the lower right corner, using only the tips of his fingers. Noah had insisted that old books deserved patience rather than speed. It had been a habit so unusual that Lucien had teased him about it during long afternoons together. No one else had ever copied it. "Who taught you to restore manuscripts?" Lucien asked, unable to hide his curiosity any longer. Nathan paused for only a heartbeat before answering. "Someone who believed that preserving knowledge was another way of preserving people." The words settled heavily between them. Lucien remembered hearing nearly the same sentence years ago while Noah gently repaired a torn map inside the royal study. His pulse quickened despite every effort to remain composed. Nathan closed the ancient book and finally lifted his eyes for the briefest moment. Their gazes met across the quiet library. Something unreadable flickered behind the librarian's calm expression before he lowered his eyes once again. In that silent exchange, Lucien realized the feeling that had haunted him since entering the library was no illusion. Somewhere beneath the carefully crafted identity of Nathan Gray lived a truth that refused to remain buried forever. Nathan Gray became an impossible thought that refused to leave Lucien's mind. Throughout the rest of the day, every council report sounded distant. Every diplomatic discussion blurred into meaningless words, and every signature placed upon royal decrees felt automatic. By evening, the king dismissed his advisors earlier than usual, choosing silence over conversation. For the first time in years, he found himself walking back toward the Grand Royal Library instead of the Western Gardens where he normally ended each day. The towering shelves stood peacefully beneath warm lantern light, yet Nathan was nowhere to be seen. An elderly archivist greeted the king with a respectful bow before quietly explaining that the restoration staff worked rotating schedules and rarely remained after sunset. Lucien thanked him, but instead of leaving, he wandered through the endless rows of books. His fingers brushed across polished wooden shelves until they stopped before a familiar collection of poetry. 5 years earlier, Noah had once insisted that every ruler should spend as much time reading poems as studying military history because people revealed themselves through stories more honestly than through politics. Lucien had laughed at the idea then. Now those forgotten words echoed with painful clarity. As he reached for one particular volume, another hand gently lifted the same book from the opposite side of the shelf. Nathan stepped into view, equally surprised by the unexpected meeting. For a brief second, neither of them spoke. The silence felt strangely comfortable, as though two old friends had simply resumed an unfinished conversation. Nathan smiled politely before offering the book to the king. "Please, Your Majesty." Lucien accepted it, but did not open the cover. Instead, He studied the librarian with growing curiosity. "You seem to know this library better than anyone." Nathan lowered his eyes modestly. "Books become easier to understand when you spend enough years listening to them." Lucian almost smiled. Noah had once said nearly the same thing while convincing him that libraries were never truly quiet because every page carried someone's voice. The coincidence felt too precise to ignore. They began walking together through the quiet hall, without any clear destination. Nathan spoke about preserving damaged manuscripts collected from abandoned monasteries, forgotten villages, and distant kingdoms beyond the mountains. His knowledge was extraordinary, detailed enough to impress even the palace scholars. Yet what fascinated Lucian even more was the compassion behind every explanation. Nathan never described books as objects. He described them as memories waiting to be protected before time erased them forever. That philosophy belonged to Noah as surely as the sunrise belonged to morning. They eventually stopped before a large stained glass window overlooking the palace gardens. Autumn leaves drifted gently across marble pathways below, while fountains reflected the fading golden sky. Nathan looked outside with peaceful admiration. "A garden only survives because someone quietly tends it every day," he said softly. "Most people only notice the flowers." Lucian felt another unexpected chill. Years ago, Noah had spoken those exact words after helping the palace gardeners plant new white roses near the eastern gate. There was no possibility that two strangers had created identical thoughts, identical habits, identical gestures, and identical expressions by chance. As Nathan prepared to excuse himself, a small folded piece of parchment slipped unnoticed from the stack of books he carried. It landed silently near Lucian's boots. Nathan continued walking without realizing it had fallen. The king bent down and picked it up, intending only to return it. But before he could call out, a familiar drawing caught his attention. It was a tiny sketch of a skylark resting upon an olive branch, drawn with delicate pencil strokes. 5 years ago, Noah had filled the margins of nearly every notebook with that exact little bird because he believed skylarks always found their way home, no matter how long the journey. Lucian quietly folded the small parchment and slipped it inside his coat before calling Nathan's name. But the librarian had already disappeared beyond the towering shelves as though the palace itself had swallowed him. That night the king returned to his private study instead of retiring to his chambers. He placed the delicate sketch beneath the warm glow of a single oil lamp and stared at the tiny skylark for what felt like hours. Every line, every careful curve, every feather had been drawn with remarkable precision. He unlocked an old cedar chest that had remained untouched for years and carefully removed several journals that once belonged to Noah. Their leather covers had faded with time, but inside the margins, beside poems and maps and unfinished thoughts, dozens of little skylarks rested upon olive branches. Lucian compared them one by one until his breathing slowed. The angle of the wings, the shape of the tiny beak, even. The way the tail feathers curved toward the corner of the page matched perfectly. It was not merely similar. It was identical. His logical mind searched desperately for another explanation, but none existed. The following morning, Lucian ordered a complete report on every scholar, archivist, translator, and librarian who had entered the palace during the past 5 years. His royal chancellor, Theodore Winslow, found the request unusual but asked no questions. By midday, a thick collection of records rested upon the king's desk. Lucian immediately searched for Nathan Gray. The file was surprisingly thin. According to the official documents, Nathan had arrived only 3 years earlier after receiving outstanding recommendations from an isolated monastery renowned for preserving historical manuscripts. His references appeared authentic, his work impeccable, and every supervisor described him with nearly identical words. Quiet, honest, humble, dedicated. Yet one detail refused to fit. There was almost nothing recorded about Nathan's life before the monastery. 3 years of flawless service rested upon a foundation that seemed strangely empty. That afternoon, Lucian returned to the library with no royal escort, carrying only the ancient poetry collection they had both reached for the previous evening. Nathan was seated beside a tall window, carefully repairing loose pages with remarkable patience. Sunlight filtered through colored glass, painting soft blue and gold patterns across the wooden table. Without looking up, Nathan spoke first. Your Majesty appears to enjoy this section more often lately. A faint smile crossed Lucien's face. Perhaps I am discovering that I ignored the most important room in my own palace. Nathan looked up, meeting the king's eyes for a brief moment before smiling politely. Sometimes the answers we search for have been quietly waiting in the same place all along. The sentence settled deeply inside Lucien. It sounded less like casual conversation and more like someone gently placing another piece into a puzzle neither of them was ready to complete. They spent the next hour discussing forgotten kingdoms, ancient maps, and legends surrounding the first Alpha and Omega rulers. Nathan possessed an extraordinary ability to connect history with ordinary human choices, speaking not of famous victories, but of forgiveness, sacrifice, and hope. Lucien realized he was no longer asking questions simply to satisfy suspicion. He genuinely wanted to hear Nathan's thoughts. As the afternoon light began to fade, Nathan carefully closed the final manuscript and stood to return it to its shelf. His sleeve slipped back for only an instant, revealing a narrow silver bracelet resting against his wrist. Lucien's heart nearly stopped. 5 years earlier, on the day Noah promised they would always find their way back to one another, Lucien had personally fastened that simple silver bracelet around Noah's wrist, engraving its hidden clasp with 4 quiet words that no one else in the kingdom had ever seen. Always find your way home. Lucien waited until Nathan reached for another manuscript before quietly stepping forward. May I see your bracelet? He asked with careful composure. Nathan instinctively lowered his sleeve, though the movement carried no fear, only quiet hesitation. It is only an old keepsake, Your Majesty. Lucien's eyes never left the narrow band of silver now hidden beneath the linen cuff. It was a gift. Nathan remained silent for several long seconds before giving a small nod. Yes. From your family? Lucien asked. Nathan looked toward the stained glass window where afternoon sunlight scattered gentle colors across the library floor. From someone who once believed every journey deserved a way back home. The answer struck Lucien with the force of a forgotten promise. Those exact words had never been written in any official letter or spoken before anyone else. They belonged to one quiet evening years ago when he had fastened that bracelet around Noah's wrist beneath the old oak tree overlooking the eastern cliffs. Only the two of them had been there. No witness had heard the promise. No servant had recorded the moment. The silence between them became almost tangible. Lucien wanted to ask the question burning inside him, yet every instinct urged patience. If Nathan truly was Noah, forcing, the truth might drive him away again. Instead, the king gently changed the subject, asking about the oldest manuscript currently under restoration. Nathan relaxed almost imperceptibly and carefully unfolded a weathered map across the reading table. He explained how generations of scholars had preserved fragile documents not because parchment possessed value, but because memory did. People often believe kingdoms survive because of strong rulers, Nathan said softly while smoothing the edge of the ancient map. I think they survive because ordinary people quietly remember what kindness looked like. Lucien listened without interrupting. That was Noah's greatest gift. Even years ago, while others admired crowns and victories, Noah had always spoken about teachers, healers, librarians, gardeners, and families who quietly shaped the future without expecting recognition. As the conversation continued, Lucien noticed another detail. Nathan never referred to the palace as though he were still discovering it. Instead, he instinctively described forgotten hallways, hidden reading rooms, and restoration workshops that even many senior officials had never visited. His familiarity extended beyond the library itself. It was the confidence of someone who had once called these halls home. Before leaving, Lucien thanked Nathan for sharing his knowledge. The librarian bowed respectfully, but this time there was unmistakable warmth behind the gesture. Knowledge becomes lighter when it is shared, Nathan replied. The sentence lingered in Lucien's thoughts throughout the evening. After returning to his private chambers, he ordered no further investigations. Instead, he opened Noah's final journal once more, turning carefully through familiar pages until he reached a passage written only days before the reported tragedy. The handwriting remained steady and elegant. At the bottom of the page, beneath reflections about hope and responsibility, Noah had written one final sentence. If the day ever comes when everyone believes I am gone, I hope the people I love will search for truth instead of certainty. Lucian slowly closed the journal, his heartbeat steady for the first time in years. He no longer wondered whether Nathan Gray reminded him of Noah Sterling. The real question had become far more unsettling. If Noah had chosen to disappear, then someone else had carefully arranged for an entire kingdom, including its own king, to stop searching. The next morning, Lucian made a decision that surprised everyone except himself. Instead of assigning his royal guard to investigate Nathan Gray, he quietly ordered every report connected to Noah's final days to be brought to his private office without informing the council. If someone had hidden the truth for 5 years, then announcing another investigation would only give that person time to erase whatever remained. Hour after hour, the king examined faded records, travel permits, physician notes, supply inventories, and correspondence that had once seemed ordinary. What disturbed him was not what the documents contained, but what they lacked. Entire weeks surrounding Noah's reported death had been reduced to unusually brief summaries. Several witness statements had disappeared altogether. Even the registry recording everyone who entered the Eastern Palace wing during that season contained pages that had been carefully replaced by newer parchment. It was not the work of chance. It was the work of someone patient enough to rewrite history without drawing attention. That realization shifted something inside Lucian. For years he had believed he had failed Noah. Now he began to wonder whether they had both been trapped inside a story written by someone else. Rather than confronting Nathan, Lucian continued visiting the library as though nothing had changed. Their conversations gradually became part of his daily routine. They spoke about forgotten civilizations, ancient languages, and the responsibility carried by every generation. Nathan possessed an extraordinary gift for making history feel alive. Every lesson ended not with dates or names, but with a question about kindness, justice, or courage. Lucian realized that his own decisions as king had quietly changed because of those conversations. He listened longer before judging. He questioned traditions that no longer served the people. He began visiting schools, hospitals, and public libraries without ceremony, simply to observe how ordinary families lived. Word spread throughout the kingdom that the king had become more approachable than ever before. No one knew that the quiet librarian had inspired those changes. One rainy afternoon, while helping Nathan organize a newly delivered collection of journals from an abandoned monastery, Lucian noticed a small wooden box tucked behind several aging volumes. Nathan reached for it almost immediately, but the king had already lifted it from the shelf. It was beautifully carved with tiny skylarks circling an olive tree. Nathan's calm expression faltered for the first time. "That box should remain sealed," he said gently. Lucian looked at him with quiet curiosity. "Why?" Nathan hesitated before answering. "Because sometimes preserving peace requires leaving certain memories asleep until the right moment arrives." Lucian slowly traced the carved birds with his thumb. "And how do we know when that moment has arrived?" Nathan met his eyes, and for the first time the careful distance he had maintained seemed to disappear. Sadness, hope, and exhaustion rested together behind his quiet smile. When the person searching for the truth is willing to accept that the answer may change everything they believe about themselves. Before Lucian could respond, the library doors opened, and Royal Chancellor Theodore Winslow entered carrying several official documents requiring the king's signature. Theodore politely acknowledged Nathan before placing the papers upon the nearest table. As Lucian signed the final page, Theodore casually remarked that preparations were complete for the annual Founders Ceremony, including the traditional remembrance honoring those who had been lost 5 years earlier. Nathan's hand tightened almost invisibly around the edge of the wooden shelf. Lucian noticed the reaction immediately. In that silent moment, he understood one thing with complete certainty. Nathan was not afraid of being recognized. He was afraid of what would happen to the kingdom if the truth finally stepped into the light. The annual Founders Ceremony arrived beneath clear autumn skies, drawing nobles, scholars, merchants, and families from every province into the palace grounds. For generations, the ceremony had honored the kingdom's history while reminding every citizen that peace was built by those willing to protect one another. This year, however, Lucian observed the celebration through different eyes. Every smiling face reminded him how easily an entire nation could accept a story without ever questioning who had written it. Nathan remained inside the Grand Royal Library, claiming that several fragile manuscripts required immediate restoration before winter humidity settled over the old parchment. Although the explanation sounded reasonable, Lucien sensed another reason beneath the calm words. Nathan was avoiding the ceremony. More precisely, he was avoiding the memorial held each year for those believed to have died 5 years earlier. Instead of joining the afternoon banquet immediately after the opening procession, Lucien quietly slipped away from the celebration and returned to the library carrying a tray with tea and fresh bread. Nathan looked genuinely surprised when the king entered without guards or attendants. "Your Majesty should be with your guests," he said softly. Lucien smiled as he placed the tray upon the reading table. "Today I would rather share lunch with someone who reminds me why this kingdom deserves protecting." Nathan lowered his eyes, clearly touched by the unexpected kindness, yet sadness lingered behind his gentle expression. They ate in peaceful silence while sunlight filtered through the stained glass windows, filling the library with shifting colors that danced across rows of ancient books. After several quiet moments, Lucien finally spoke. "Do you believe people can disappear without abandoning those they love?" Nathan rested his hands around the warm teacup before answering. "Sometimes disappearing is the only way to keep the people you love alive inside the future you hope they will have." Lucien listened carefully. There was no hesitation in Nathan's voice, only quiet conviction born from personal experience. "And if the people left behind believe they have been abandoned?" Nathan closed his eyes briefly. "Then they carry a wound they never deserved. But perhaps one day they will also understand the reason." Those words settled heavily between them. Lucien no longer felt as though he were speaking to a stranger hiding behind another name. He felt as though Noah himself had been answering questions that had remained locked inside his heart for 5 years. Before either of them could continue, the great bell in the palace courtyard began ringing, signaling the beginning of the remembrance ceremony. The distant voices of thousands echoed through the open windows as names of those lost were read aloud one by one. Nathan slowly stood and walked toward the window overlooking the central square. From where they stood, they could not see the gathering below, only hear the solemn voices carried by the autumn breeze. Then one familiar name drifted upward through the quiet air. Noah Sterling. Nathan's shoulders trembled almost imperceptibly before becoming still once again. Lucien stepped beside him without speaking. Neither man looked toward the courtyard. They simply listened together as the kingdom honored someone who had never truly left. In that silent moment, Lucien realized the greatest deception had never been convincing people that Noah had died. It had been convincing Noah that revealing the truth would destroy everything he had spent 5 years protecting. The echoes of the remembrance ceremony faded with the evening light, but neither Lucien nor Nathan moved from the library window for several quiet moments. The silence between them no longer felt uncertain. It carried the weight of 5 lost years and the fragile hope that truth no longer needed to remain hidden forever. Finally, Lucien turned toward Nathan with the same calm dignity that had guided his kingdom through countless hardships. "I am not going to ask whether you are Noah," he said gently, "because my heart answered that question long before my mind was willing to believe it." Nathan lowered his gaze, and for the first time since they had met again, the careful composure he had protected so faithfully began to soften. "If you already know," he whispered, "then you also know why I could never say it aloud." Lucien slowly shook his head. "No, I only know that someone I trusted disappeared while trying to protect something greater than himself. Everything else is still hidden from me." Nathan walked toward one of the towering bookshelves and carefully rested his hand upon its polished wood. 5 years ago, several families within the kingdom discovered documents proving that old rivalries could be used to divide the provinces again. There were people who wanted fear to become stronger than trust. They believed that if the future king lost the person closest to him, grief would make every decision easier to influence. They underestimated you. They also underestimated the people who quietly refused to let hatred grow. Lucien listened without interruption. There was no bitterness in Nathan's voice, only quiet honesty. "I was given one impossible choice," Nathan continued. "Remain Noah Sterling and allow those secrets to spread until innocent families paid the price, or disappear completely, while trusted scholars carried the evidence into safe hands beyond the capital. If Noah remained alive, every person helping him would have been discovered. If Noah died, everyone stopped searching. Lucien closed his eyes briefly as years of unanswered questions finally began falling into place. You carried that burden alone. Nathan smiled sadly. Not alone. There were teachers, monks, librarians, and ordinary citizens who believed protecting peace was worth sacrificing recognition. None of them wanted rewards. They only wanted children to grow up without inheriting another generation of fear. Lucien stepped closer, leaving only a respectful distance between them. You believed I would never forgive you. Nathan answered with painful honesty. I believed you deserved the chance to become the king this kingdom needed instead of the man waiting for someone who could never safely return. The king looked at him with quiet warmth rather than anger. You gave me the opportunity to become a better ruler. But you also carried every lonely day of those 5 years believing you no longer had a place beside me. Nathan's eyes filled with emotion he had hidden for far too long. Lucien did not reach for him or demand anything in return. Instead, he simply spoke the same promise that had once been engraved inside a simple silver bracelet. Home is not a place that disappears because time passes. It is where people choose to welcome each other back. Nathan slowly raised his eyes, and for the first time since fate had separated them, hope replaced the quiet sorrow that had lived behind them. Outside the library windows, the last light of sunset settled gently across the palace gardens, and both men understood that the hardest part of their journey had never been surviving 5 years apart. It would be finding the courage to let an entire kingdom discover that the greatest act of loyalty had been hidden in plain sight all along. 1 week later, the Great Hall of Astero welcomed representatives from every province, every academy, every guild, and every noble house for what had been announced as a royal address concerning the future of the kingdom. No one expected the gathering to become the moment history quietly changed direction. King Lucien Ashcroft stood before his people with the same calm confidence that had guided the nation through years of peace. Behind him, the royal banner hung beside a new white standard embroidered with a single skylark resting upon an olive branch. When the murmurs settled into complete silence, Lucien spoke without ceremony. For many years I believed that strength meant carrying every burden alone. I was wrong. A kingdom survives because ordinary people choose honesty over fear, compassion over pride, and truth over comfort. His words echoed through the chamber as every listener watched in respectful silence. The king then invited one final guest to step forward. Nathan Gray walked through the great doors dressed in the simple robes of a royal librarian rather than noble attire. Many guests recognized him only as the quiet scholar who had spent years restoring forgotten manuscripts. Lucien turned toward him with quiet respect instead of royal authority. There is one person this kingdom has thanked without ever knowing his name, and another person it mourned without ever knowing the truth. A gentle wave of surprise spread through the hall. Nathan looked toward the assembled citizens before slowly removing the silver spectacles that had hidden part of his face for so many years. He reached for the narrow bracelet resting beneath his sleeve, revealing the familiar engraving that had never left his wrist. The silence became almost sacred as recognition slowly appeared across countless faces. Lucien did not ask anyone to kneel. He did not accuse anyone of failure. He simply told the complete story with patience, explaining how courage had sometimes required silence, how peace had been protected by teachers, librarians, monks, and ordinary families whose names would never appear in history books. He revealed that Noah Sterling had chosen sacrifice over recognition, not to save a crown, but to protect the future of innocent people who would never know what had nearly been lost. When he finished speaking, there was no outrage inside the great hall. There were only tears, quiet smiles, and a deep understanding that true loyalty often looked nothing like legend. Lucien then announced the founding of the Royal Academy of Memory, a place where history, literature, diplomacy, and public service would be taught together so future generations would understand that wisdom and kindness belonged beside courage. He asked Noah to lead the academy, not because of his past, but because of the future he had helped preserve. Noah accepted with quiet gratitude, standing beside the king not as a symbol of tragedy, but as a partner in rebuilding trust. In the months that followed, forgotten records were restored, hidden stories were preserved, and the palace library became one of the most respected centers of learning in the continent. Children wandered through its halls with curiosity instead of fear, discovering that every book carried another chance to understand someone different from themselves. Visitors often noticed the king spending quiet afternoons there beside the academy's director, discussing poetry, history, and the hopes they held for the generations yet to come. Years later, travelers would ask how Astera became known as the Kingdom of the Open Library. The oldest librarians always answered with the same gentle smile. Because one king learned that love without trust cannot endure, and one Omega proved that the greatest acts of devotion are not remembered because they are loud, but because they quietly give others a better tomorrow.